It started long before the bombs fell, before the red alerts and the blackouts and the mass funerals. It started with fatigue, the kind that builds over decades and generations, the kind of exhaustion that doesn't show in the news, but lives in conversations cut short, in the way people flinch at thunder, in the way families keep go-bags by the door as casually as they keep shoes. Liraz in Ashkelon always knew the sirens would come again. She had heard them in 2014, when the Gaza war sent rockets into her street, and again in 2021, during the 11-day war with Hamas. Her children could distinguish the sound of outgoing artillery from incoming rockets before they could ride bicycles. But in 2027, it was different. Longer, louder, sharper. The first missile that broke through Iron Dome didn't just break concrete, it shattered the illusion that this was still a containable conflict. She watched her neighbor's car burn in the street and saw a child's shoe in the rubble and didn't know whose child it had been. At the same time, in Shiraz, Massa watched social media spiral into chaos. Footage of Israeli jets over Syria, videos of Iranian missile launches from the western provinces, images of young men boarding buses marked with IRGC logos. Her cousin, Mehdi, a university student studying electrical engineering, had been quietly conscripted, not because he believed in the cause, but because he needed the military ID to secure ration coupons for his family. He had been sent west toward Kermanshah, near the border where Israel had previously struck suspected missile depots in 2019 and 2021, in what they called the campaign between the wars. She remembered when he used to post poetry on Instagram, but now his account was silent, and his last story was a shot of the bus window and a goodbye emoji. In Jerusalem, an older woman named Talia sat on her balcony lighting memorial candles for her husband, who had died of cancer 2 years ago. She hadn't moved to a shelter yet. "If it's going to come, let it come," she told her daughter on the phone, who begged her to leave. She remembered the 1973 Yom Kippur War. She remembered being evacuated in 1991 during the Scud missile threat from Iraq. But she was too tired now. Too many wars. Too many memorials. In Tehran, Farshid, a father of 4, tried to calculate how much rice they had left. The prices at the bazaar had doubled overnight, then tripled. The sanctions, already suffocating since 2018 when the U.S. pulled out of the JCPOA, had become worse. Now the internet was unstable, the power cut for 3 hours at a time, and the lines for gasoline stretched for blocks. His youngest daughter cried every time a fighter jet passed overhead, and his wife had taken to writing prayers on scraps of paper and burning them at night, quietly, hoping no neighbors would report them for being superstitious. In Tiberias, 9-year-old Elad couldn't sleep without the dog in the shelter. He had named the dog Kippet Barzel, Iron Dome, because the real one sometimes missed. His father was gone, serving near the Lebanon border, where Hezbollah had begun launching rockets again, but this time in coordinated salvos, like they had in the 2006 war, but heavier, deadlier. Families from Kiryat Shmona to Safed had fled south. Elad's mother tried to play cartoons for him on her phone when the power stayed on, but most of the time they sat in the shelter and listened to the distant hum of drones. Sometimes she cried into a blanket. And all across both countries, there were sounds and silences that would haunt people forever, like the soft hum of an air conditioner that suddenly stops before an impact, or the screech of tires as a father slams on the brakes when a siren goes off. In Isfahan, where a fuel depot had exploded the night before, Reza, who drove a taxi, circled past fire trucks and mangled metal, trying to get people to hospitals whose corridors were already full. He saw a teenage boy in a hoodie holding a girl's hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white, both of them bleeding from their ears but refusing to let go. They were in line for kebab, someone said. Just in line. In Haifa, in a cramped apartment above the port, Sammy, a 64-year-old Arab Israeli, kept the radio on low volume all day. Not for news, which was useless now, but for voices, for anything human. He lived alone since his wife died in 2025, and his children had moved to Europe, tired of trying to belong to two countries at once. His neighbors had left when the first Iranian drone struck the oil tanks near the harbor, turning the sky a sick orange. He stayed behind because there was nowhere else to go. He heard both Hebrew and Arabic prayers floating through the night, sometimes together, sometimes in argument. He made tea every evening for no one, and once left an extra cup outside his door, just in case. In Karaj, west of Tehran, Azadeh was a midwife in a small clinic running on a backup generator. She hadn't been home in 4 days. They'd run out of antibiotics, and the ambulance hadn't come since last week. The baby born that night was her 13th delivery of the week, and the mother almost bled out from stress-induced complications. "Don't name the child yet," she told her gently. "Wait until tomorrow. Wait until you know she's staying." That was the rule now. Don't name the baby until the second night. It was easier that way when things went wrong. In Ramla, 2 families, one Jewish, one Arab, shared a basement storage room during the worst of the bombing. They had barely spoken before, though they lived in the same building for years. But on the second night underground, someone passed around instant coffee, and then dates, and then they started talking about children, and mothers, and recipes. War collapses space, and sometimes even walls. In calm, pilgrims still came, defying the air raids, believing that no harm would come near the shrines. But the markets around them were empty. Vendors sold bread from beneath tarps and looked to the sky with every sound. The ministry had installed loudspeakers to warn of incoming air raids, but half the time they malfunctioned. In Nahariya, Avital, a nurse, pulled a night shift at a trauma center that had turned into a triage tent. She had worked during COVID-19, had seen people die gasping alone. This was worse. The children this time weren't sick. They were shattered. One girl had lost her leg and asked if she'd still be able to dance at her bat mitzvah. Avital told her yes. She wasn't sure why she lied. On the 3rd week of the war, oil prices spiked and world markets panicked. But inside Iran, people didn't need news to know. They felt it in their stomachs. The price of eggs in Mashhad quadrupled. Meat disappeared entirely. The elderly dug into jars of preserved tomatoes and broke their fasts early because food no longer obeyed the clock. There were bread riots in Ahvaz. People lined up for hours for propane in the snow. In Tehran, children stopped going to school. Teachers had stopped showing up too, and most parents wouldn't let them walk alone anyway. In Tel Aviv, the boulevards were quieter than anyone could remember. The cafes had closed. The university dorms were empty. Ben Gurion Airport was silent except for foreign diplomats being flown out under armored escort. And still the war continued. Every day brought new numbers. 4 dead here, 9 dead there, 27 wounded, 300 displaced. But numbers were lies. They couldn't capture the scent of burnt plastic or the sound a mother makes when her son doesn't answer the phone. People in both countries tried to find meaning. Clerics in Qom called it a holy defense. Rabbis in Safed called it a sacred war for survival. Neither could explain why so many children were dying. People on both sides blamed the other. Protesters in Tel Aviv shouted down the government for letting it escalate. Protesters in Tehran held signs that simply said, "Enough." But protest was dangerous. In Iran, the Basij were already back on the streets, cracking skulls like they had during the 2022 Masa Amini protests. In Israel, some people whispered that the prime minister had allowed this to happen, had needed the war to stay in power, had baited Iran, had stalled ceasefires on purpose. Conspiracies fed on silence, and silence was everywhere. In Holon, Ilan and Noah, newlyweds, spent their honeymoon in a bomb shelter. They had been planning to visit Greece. Instead, they used the mattress from the guest room and lit tea candles in glass jars and told each other, "We'll remember this." In Shiraz, Masa found her cousin's name on a list that circulated online. It was just a telegram screenshot. His name was spelled wrong. Her mother told her to delete it. "That's not proof," she said, but she already knew. The family kept the living room lights dim for a week. They didn't answer the door. They didn't tell the neighbors. They just sat together in silence, as if waiting for his ghost to walk back in and ask what's for dinner. In Hamburg, Germany, Layla opened her WhatsApp every morning with her breath held. She hadn't been back to Iran since 2016, not since her student visa turned into asylum, not since she marched with others chanting Zan, Zendagi, Azadi, woman, life, freedom, and watched as the protests were crushed. She hadn't spoken Farsi publicly in years. Now she scrolled through endless messages from cousins and friends stuck in the war zone, videos of flattened buildings in Yazd, voice notes whispered in darkness. "They hit a school today," one cousin said. "The children were hiding in the boiler room." Layla didn't cry anymore. Her tears had dried somewhere between exile and disbelief. Her German neighbors gave her awkward looks now, like she might be part of something foreign and violent, as if she had launched the missiles herself. In New York, 22-year-old Yonatan, an Israeli-American student at Columbia, stared at his phone during a lecture about international relations, watching live drone feeds of southern Israel burning. His brother was in the IDF, stationed near the Syrian border. They hadn't spoken since Yonatan had criticized the government during the last round of judicial protests in 2023. Now he couldn't remember why he was angry. He just wanted to know if he was alive. On campus, protests erupted daily. One group screamed, "Free Palestine." Another waved Israeli flags, and Yonatan stood between them, mute, watching slogans fly like bullets, watching people try to simplify something that was eating his country alive. He went home early that day and stayed in bed, listening to recordings of his grandmother speaking in Polish about the Holocaust. He needed a reminder that pain could be survived. In Kermanshah, a wedding was held in secret. The bride wore her sister's dress. The groom's brother was missing, last seen at a forward base near the Iraq border, but they decided to go ahead anyway. There was no music, just whispered blessings. They kissed once, gently, and the neighbors clapped as softly as wind. In Ashdod, A family buried their father without a headstone. The cemetery was full, and the city warned of cluster bombs. The rabbi said a brief prayer as the sirens howled, and they all ran for cover mid-Kaddish. They finished a prayer underground, beneath the sound of falling steel. The war had lasted 47 days by then. The world was already forgetting. News cycles had moved on to other fires. But in Birjand, in southern Iran, a man named Omid spent every morning searching through satellite images online, trying to find signs of his uncle's apartment block. He wasn't a soldier or a spy, just someone desperate for a glimpse of home. The building was gone. He wasn't sure when. He emailed an old neighbor who never responded. Some said it was a misfire by the IRGC. Others said it was an Israeli retaliation for a drone factory nearby. Omid printed out a blurry image of the rubble and folded it into his wallet. It was all he had left. And in Eilat, far to the south, where the rockets hadn't reached but the fear had, a woman named Rena kept lighting candles in the sand. Not religious, not orthodox, but the act felt right. She had lost her son in the first week of fighting, killed when a missile hit his convoy near the Golan Heights. They buried him quickly. She couldn't even remember what he'd been wearing. She thought about him constantly, but most often she thought about his hands, how he used to peel oranges for her when she was sick. Her husband had stopped talking. They lived in the same house, but in separate silences. She walked the shoreline alone most evenings, whispering names into the water. Sometimes other mothers joined her. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Outside of the war zones in Istanbul, in Paris, in Toronto, the diaspora communities held vigils. Some carried candles, some carried flags. Some argued about politics, some just cried. Iranian Jews in Los Angeles organized blood drives for Israeli hospitals, even while their cousins in Tehran huddled in bombed-out apartments. Israeli Arabs in Haifa helped shelter ultra-Orthodox families who had no place to go after their yeshivas were evacuated. Lines were breaking. Identities were cracking open. Nothing made sense anymore except pain, and even that stopped being sharp, just dull, ever-present pressure. By the time the ceasefire came, not peace, not an agreement, just exhaustion dressed as diplomacy, over 10,000 were dead, and nobody knew what the war had changed, except everything. Schools were rubble, families were scattered. The black market for fuel in Iran was so vast that children carried canisters on their backs for a living. In Israel, therapy wait lists stretched for months. Entire generations of children spoke in numbers and codes. How close was it? Did the sirens go off? Was it a red alert or a white one? They played games mimicking the bomb shelters. A little girl in Beersheba pretended her doll had PTSD. Nobody laughed. In the end, it wasn't missiles that stayed in people's memories. It was moments, a stolen cup of tea, a broken promise to return, the echo of a song played in a shelter, the weight of a name scrawled in charcoal on a crumbling wall, a piece of bread split between strangers, a boy too afraid to sleep, a mother who wouldn't let go of her son's phone, even after it stopped ringing. In the months after the ceasefire, the world moved on. A summit in Geneva, a handshake between men in suits, headlines that said tensions ease after historic agreement, but no one in Jerusalem or Tehran felt historic. They felt tired. In Iraq, electricity came back 3 hours a day. The water tasted like rust. Children played soccer near craters. The ball bounced strangely in the holes. Fatemeh, 16, stopped going to school after her older brother died. She didn't talk much. She sat by the window and drew maps of countries that didn't exist, places with names like No Border, Peaceland, and Tomorrow. She showed them to no one. Her mother watched her carefully. She'd seen this kind of silence before, during the pandemic, during the protests, during her own youth when the Iran-Iraq war killed her cousins one by one. "It doesn't end," she whispered to herself. "It just changes shape." In Sterot, the parks had reopened. They looked like parks again, if you didn't look too closely at the concrete shelters painted like mushrooms, if you didn't hear the kids play Red Alert, the way children used to play tag. Daniel, a paramedic, returned to work after losing his leg in a drone strike. He didn't remember the explosion. He only remembered waking up and hearing someone crying next to him. It wasn't his voice, but it could have been. He spoke at a school once, about resilience, about surviving. The children didn't ask about his prosthetic. They asked, "Did it hurt more when you thought you were dying, or after?" He didn't know how to answer that. He said something kind, something vague, and left the room shaking. In Yazd, mosques opened soup kitchens. In Be'er Sheva, synagogues collected clothes for the north. Old women packed boxes side by side with teenagers who didn't believe in God but believed in helping. There was a kind of softness that bloomed in ruins. It didn't last long, but it happened. For a few weeks, people fed each other without asking names. In Ramallah, graffiti showed an Israeli child and an Iranian child holding hands, while behind them, cities burned. Someone painted over it a week later. Still, it had existed. The exiles watched closely. In Berlin, Layla joined a group for survivors of conflict. Syrians, Sudanese, Ukrainians, Afghans. They didn't all speak the same language, but pain translated well. They made tea for each other and shared photos of homes they couldn't go back to. One day she brought a photo of her grandmother's garden in Shiraz. A Syrian man stared at it for a long time. "This could be my home," he said. They didn't need to say more. In Tel Aviv, Yonatan finally called his brother. They didn't talk about the war. They talked about their mother's soup, about the cat that still wandered outside the childhood apartment, about the sea. There was silence between the words, but it was a kind silence. A silence made of choosing each other over everything else. In Isfahan, Mahsa eventually learned that her cousin's body had been buried in a mass grave near the border. No markers, no names. Her family held a private ceremony in their courtyard. They lit candles in jam jars. No one said martyr. No one said hero. Just, he was ours. By winter, the debris had been cleared in some places. Not all. There were still streets in Nahariya that smelled of smoke, still buildings in Tehran whose top floors were just rebar and sky. People adapted. They always do. A family opened a new bakery in Kermanshah, and every third loaf was given free to anyone who asked. A group of teenagers in Netanya formed a band called Shelter Songs and played in bombed-out community centers. Their songs were mostly about ordinary things: missing someone, waiting, walking under a strange sky. But the wounds didn't heal in order. Trauma came in waves. There were nights when the dreams returned, when fireworks caused panic, when planes overhead made people hold their breath. A woman in Tabriz refused to take the elevator anymore. A boy in Ashkelon wouldn't walk near playgrounds, too open, too vulnerable. Therapy was expensive. Most people just talked to each other. Some drank more. Some stopped talking altogether. But time passed, as it does, and slowly, very slowly, Something like life returned. The war became something people referenced with an expression, a glance, a tightening of the jaw, not forgotten, but buried, half visible, like a cracked wall you choose not to fix. In Jerusalem, Talia planted herbs on her balcony again. "We have to keep planting," she told her granddaughter. "That's how we fight forgetting." In Qom, a small child was born on the anniversary of the ceasefire. His mother named him Soli, short for Solj, peace. She didn't believe it would last, but the name felt like a wish, a fragile one, but a wish all the same. Years passed, but the war stayed. Not as fire or missiles, but as stories that children overheard in whispers, as faces in framed photos that no longer smiled. In Tehran, the official memorial was built quickly, with slogans and flags, and granite too polished to touch. Few people went. Most preferred private rituals, lighting a candle in the kitchen, muttering a name while washing rice, touching a scar before bed. In Tel Aviv, there were ceremonies with speeches and violin music and silence so heavy it swallowed the applause. Parents wore white, holding pictures. Soldiers stood straight. But nobody really knew what to say. How could you honor something that had no shape, only absence? There was no triumph. There was no closure. What remained was the quiet, the streets at dawn, the sound of someone unlocking a shop, the smell of bread rising, a taxi idling in the cold. These were the victories, that someone still got up, that children still played in alleys, that laughter returned not loudly, but sincerely. People told jokes again, mostly bad ones. People got married again, though the dancing came slower. Life went on, awkwardly, unevenly, beautifully. But for many, the war became something inherited, not just by those who survived, but by those who came after. In Haifa, a child asked her grandfather why he never walked near the sea. He didn't answer. In Shiraz, a teenager found his father's helmet in the attic and stared at it like it was an alien object. In Jerusalem, a girl wrote a poem about waiting underground. In Yazd, a boy had nightmares of skies that never cleared. These were children born after the last siren. But war had threaded itself into their blood, quietly, like a hum just beneath the noise of normal life. Some blamed politicians, others blamed history. A few still believed it had all been necessary. Most just wanted to forget. But forgetting isn't a choice. It's a slow erosion, and the things deepest in us resist it. The war remained in how people flinched at sudden loud noises, in how they paused before answering phones, in how they memorized emergency exits without thinking. Even in peace, people lived like shadows might return. And yet, there was resilience. The real kind. Not the one politicians praised, but the kind that looked like small defiance. A meal shared, a story told, a fence mended between two old neighbors who once stopped speaking. In Karaj, Azadeh kept delivering babies. She still told mothers not to name them too soon. But more often now, they did anyway. One woman named her daughter Aramesh, calm. "We are allowed," she said. "We are allowed to hope." And maybe that was the only lesson, if there was one. That survival isn't just about breath or luck. It's about choosing, again and again, to build something out of the rubble. A garden, a poem, a bakery, a lullaby. Even if the memory of fire remains, even if the silence never fully lifts. Because people aren't made to carry war forever. They're made to carry each other. Thank you for watching.